discrimination. We've had so many laws in this for so many years, but it looks like it's bigger than ever. It really goes back, if you go back recently, in about 2003 to 2004, the Me Too movement really was not very big as you go through. Me Too really deals with the aspect of women making certain that they're treated appropriately in the workplace. Finally, they filed a lot of different things. Probably the biggest thing you saw was a lot of corporate CEOs being charged with discrimination as never before as you're going through. The aspect of trading what we call quid pro quo, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later as you go through, but in other words, trading, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. Give me sex and I'll give you a promotion. That happens so often. And really, to be honest about it, we had a lot of hypocrites in my generation looking at Hollywood, and here's Hollywood over here. Everybody talked about the director's couch and the whole process, yet they were all silent in the process because it was common practice as you go out there. Frankly, I want to really look on the millennials that came up, and in the process, they started complaining about it. And frankly, they got traction on it in the Me Too movement. And I think it's one of the best things that happened to us because we started calling discrimination really for what it was and started calling out the people that practice it. Now, that being said, we're America. We always tend to go too far over one way over here. And sometimes people start fishing for things that simply aren't there. But that being said, at least now it's out in the open. But we're seeing all kinds of things from CEOs of some of the giant corporations across America sitting and elevating people as you go through over sex and everything else, over other people in the process. It's called discrimination. But let's go through and look at a couple of them as you go through. One is about, we call it disparate treatment, or another type is called disparate impact as you go through. You want to sit down and talk about what is reasonable, on an accommodation as you go through. You want to treat people equally as you go through in the process, making certain that everybody is treated appropriately and equitably in the process as you go through. Sometimes people claim, I'm discriminating against because I'm left-handed. I'm discriminated against because of the fact I wear glasses. Sometimes those things are not always appropriate, but if your employer is making accommodations for them, you need to sit down and then eliminate that as you go through. And there's certain fiscal guidelines as you go through. Let's go through on the differences between disparate treatment and disparate impact and what is reasonable accommodation. If you are going to work in the world of human resources, this chart will help you execute your job. It's simple as you go through, and it really helps you as you go through. Disparate treatment, is there intent? If the answer is yes, then the individual is a member of a protected group, qualified for a certain job as you go through, and turned down for the job, and the job remained open. That would be disparate treatment as you go through. The employer's defense, a legitimate non-discriminatory reason for the decision as you go through, based upon what we call bona fide occupational qualification, BFOQ, bona fide occupational qualification as you go through. If, for instance, you're hiring a delivery driver, and the delivery driver on a regular basis will have to pick up boxes that weigh 20 pounds to 40 pounds, take them out of the truck, walk up a sidewalk to a door, and put them at the front door, okay, then you have a bona fide occupational qualification of lifting a box that weighs 20 to 40 pounds. You literally can have that as part of the interview process, have a box over here on the floor, pick it up and carry it 50 feet over here. That could be a BFOQ or bona fide occupational qualification. Put that in your notes. That is part of the world and the jargon of human resources. Let's go back to disparate treatment. So if somebody makes a claim, okay, what was the intent as they go through? Okay, if that person says, well, I couldn't pick up that box and I felt discriminated against. Well, the answer is no, you didn't fulfill the occupational qualification, so therefore we did not hire you, and we're not obligated to hire you. And it doesn't matter what other parts, long as you have a BFOQ that's legitimate or germane to that job, you have a reason not to hire as you go through. Disparate impact. The intent? No, you don't have to show the intent. Really, you look on the display when it comes down to the data as you go through is how is the employment practice? Can you show that people of a certain race, usually under or one of the categories of Title VII as you go through, do you have a disproportionate amount of people ignored because of one of those characteristics as you go through? You have to show that there's a relationship on the employer between the manifest relationship and the job performance and everything else. But this is an area that's a big deal where data comes in as you go through. Reasonable accommodation. Individual has a belief or disability provided with the employer. They ask for something over there, and did the employer do anything? The answer is yes or no as you go through the process. And as you go through, at one time I had an issue. I had a series of people that had problems, really motor issues when it came down to typing. We had a lot of carpal tunnel. We had a lot of neck injuries. People that did clerical work. I brought in somebody that came in. We looked on the actual work environment. We had 19 people in 2 years that had different kinds of complaints. And we sat down there and brought somebody in that worked on the workplaces for them to make them better in the process. And all of a sudden, those 19 people, by the time we were all done, 12 of them really had long-term changes to their work and their life was much better. 4 of them sat down there and had almost immediate effect. And only 3 of them at the end of that work time had a serious physical issue that had to be dealt with through surgery or something else. We really solved a lot of problems by going through making a reasonable accommodation, but going the extra step and making certain that people are talking to the employer as to what the work environment is. And we solved a lot of problems as you go through. Disparate treatment, sometimes you'll see the plaintiff's rebuttal as you go through. The reason offended was merely a pretext for discrimination, and they'll look for monetary damages. And the same thing in the aspect of disparate impact as you go through and so on. Save the table, it's really good. Know the difference between disparate treatment, disparate impact, and have an idea as to what the employer is looking for and the employee in the process as you go through. That is part of human resources as you go through. Disparate treatment, when people are treated differently because of race or sex or the like, the plaintiff has a burden to sit down there and show that, and usually the defendant should have a BFOQ in the process, and you have a different aspect of, but a lot of the disparate treatments I've been involved with have had mixed motive cases as you go through, and this is hard to prove if you have an honest employer doing their best to sit down there and deal with the employees. Sometimes the employer may think they're being honestly treating their employees, and you may have a difference of opinion there, but for the most part, a well-intentioned employer really shows up as you go through. Disparate impact occurs when there's a neutral employment practice that excludes a protected group from opportunities. Now we talk and think about the 4/5 rule. It's talked about in your book, but here's what it really comes down to. It does 4/5. If you go back and look on the percentage, 4/5 equals 80%. Does 80% of your workforce resemble 80% of the people that you serve or your surrounding population? If it doesn't, you may have a problem in the aspect of saying, okay, you're in a community where you have different racial proportions out there as you go through. You have a certain minority group that's 50% in the community or 50% of your clientele, and almost all of your employees are all Asian, and the 50% clientele are African American or Black as you go through. That being said, you got a problem out there, and pay attention to what's going on. Pay attention to make certain that the 4/5 rule really is applied in your organization. You do that by measuring the community or the people that you serve and the people on the inside, and you compare them as you go through, and then sit down, start paying attention to your hiring practices as you go through. Here's a couple of rebuttals as you go through. By the way, Griggs versus Duke Power, in my opinion, is a major aspect of it. Sometimes as you go through, Griggs versus Duke Power, at the core of it is that the employer imposed certain standards, in this case, a test that really did not deal with the actual job itself in the process. Be careful about using employment tests hawked to you by some vendor says, this test will give you the best employees. No, it may not, because of the fact that tests must be germane to the job that you're applying for. Griggs versus Duke Power is a major aspect, and it's a reason why you should never use a personality test to hire people. I think they're wrong. I'm happy to testify as an expert witness in the process because of the fact that because you have a personality that does this, doesn't mean another personality can't do that. It should be based upon, can they do the work, not based upon the personality as you go through. That's the case at the core of Griggs versus Duke Power. Pattern of practice, the plaintiff is going to show the 3 things in class action pattern. There's statistical disparities as you go through. There's individual acts of intentional discrimination and promotion or procedures that really are discretion of the managers, not based upon data or the actual performance of the employees as you go through. This is pretty standard as you go through. Reasonable accommodation, if there's a religious activity that somebody has and they need to have time off, make sure you pay attention to that. A lot of times you give employees really personal necessity leave as you go through, to have time off as you go through. If there's a disability or accommodation as you go through, make certain you pay attention and listen to the employee. If it's relevant as you go through, that you sit down there and do not sit down and discriminate against them based upon any disability, that you make a reasonable accommodation. And there's a couple stats as you go through in the process as to what you have to do on a financial basis that's really defined within the statutory regulations to make certain they don't have a ridiculous thing. And it's usually based upon a percentage of the salary. Really discrimination as you go through, you'll see a lot of claims over the years in the process as you go through. A lot of times we're talking about discrimination. Sometimes if somebody files a complaint on it, you have this issue over here. They file a complaint into Human Resources responds, and then a supervisor turns around and retaliates against the employee. You need to caution the supervisor, they have a legal right to file a complaint. And if they had justifiable for it, you need to fix this over here and knock it off, give clear, specific direction. If they don't do that, they can sit down there and file a follow-up complaint on retaliation, and you may end up having an illegal employment practice as you're going through and actually lose money in the process in a lawsuit because of the fact retaliation is dealt with pretty harshly. Know this: disparate treatment, disparate impact, reasonable accommodation, and also what retaliation is when somebody is responding back over a complaint being filed. Take care.